Inside the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, behind environmentally controlled glass, sits a circular piece of dark brown bakelite. It is the EKCO AD65. To an art historian, it is a triumph of 1930s British modernism. To an auction house, a flawless, uncracked model can command thousands of pounds. It is revered as a definitive masterpiece of industrial design. Yet, travel 50 miles east to Southend-on-Sea, and the enormous factory that pressed that bakelite into shape is entirely gone. The heavy hydraulic presses are silent. The vast assembly lines have vanished. The workforce, which once numbered 8,000, has long since scattered. The name EKCO, Eric Kirkham Coal Limited, has been completely wiped from the British High Street. It is a profound contradiction. The brand that defined the aesthetic of the British wireless set is celebrated in museums, yet entirely dead in the retail market. A decade after its peak, the EKCO badge was still trusted in millions of sitting rooms. The company had survived the Blitz. It had built the radar systems that defended the country. It had placed a valve radio on almost every sideboard in Essex. But the real story of EKCO in Britain is not merely the triumph of the circular bakelite cabinet. It is the story of the brutal reality of corporate consolidation and brand dilution. It is the story of what happens when a fiercely independent British engineering firm is swallowed by a larger domestic rival, and then absorbed by a European giant. It is the tragedy of a name that meant absolute modernity, reduced to a cheap label on an imported cassette player before being quietly, ruthlessly switched off. Every week, we tell the stories of British radios, wireless makers, and listening habits that once shaped how people heard voices, music, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place and a specific problem. In Westcliff-on-Sea, Essex, in 1922. In 1922, the British wireless set was a magnificent, difficult object. It did not simply sit on a table and play. It demanded maintenance. For the average listener in an Essex sitting room, a radio receiver required a heavy glass accumulator battery to power the electronic valves. These accumulators were filled with corrosive sulfuric acid. When they ran flat, they could not be plugged into a wall. They had to be disconnected, carefully carried down the street, often leaking acid onto clothing, and dropped off at a local bicycle shop or garage to be recharged for 6pence a time. It was a messy, inconvenient, and deeply flawed system. The British listening habit was growing, but the physical reality of the battery radio was holding it back. What the market lacked was not a better tuning dial or a more sensitive aerial. It lacked domestic convenience. In a small room in Westcliff-on-Sea, a young engineer named Eric Kirkham Cole saw the friction in this system. Cole did not start out trying to design a beautiful radio. He was trying to solve the problem of the acid battery. His solution was a device called a battery eliminator, a heavy, utilitarian block of electronics that allowed a wireless set to draw power directly from the domestic mains electricity supply. It was an immediate revelation. Suddenly, the radio could stay in the sitting room permanently. The acid spills stopped. The trips to the bicycle shop ended. By 1926, the demand for these eliminators was so high that Cole, along with a businessman named William Verrills, officially formed EK Coal Limited. The brand was quickly shortened to its initials, EKCO. They moved their first factory setup to London Road in Leigh-on-Sea, before expanding again into a massive site in nearby Southend-on-Sea. But the battery eliminator was only a bridge. As valve technology improved, the eliminator became built into the radio itself. The mains radio, a complete unit that simply plugged into the wall, became the new standard. EKCO realized that to survive, they had to stop making accessories and start making the entire wireless set. This presented a structural problem: the cabinet. In the late 1920s, British radio cabinets were essentially pieces of traditional furniture, constructed from wood by skilled cabinet makers. This process was inherently slow. It required sanding, gluing, veneering, and varnishing. A factory could only produce as many radios as its carpenters could finish. For a company like EKCO, which wanted to manufacture at scale, wood was an expensive bottleneck. The solution was a material that had never been used for domestic furniture on such a scale: bakelite. Bakelite, an early, heavy, heat-resistant plastic, could be poured into a mold as a powder, subjected to immense heat and pressure, and ejected as a fully formed cabinet in minutes. It required no sanding, no varnish, and no carpenter. But the financial risk was staggering. The steel molds required for large radio cabinets were prohibitively expensive, and the hydraulic presses needed to stamp them were industrial leviathans. In 1930, EKCO took the gamble. They released the Model 313, a receiver housed entirely in a dark, glossy bakelite shell. It was an immediate commercial triumph. The Southend-on-Sea factory expanded its plastics division, importing massive injection molding presses from Germany. EKCO was no longer just an electronics firm, it was becoming one of the most advanced plastics manufacturers in Britain. By 1932, the Southend site was an industrial powerhouse, employing thousands of local workers and dominating the local economy. They were turning out hundreds of wireless sets a day, entirely bypassing the traditional timber supply chain. But while these early bakelite radios were efficient to produce, they still looked like wooden radios. They were boxy, angular, and designed to mimic the furniture they were replacing. The material was revolutionary, but the shape was conservative. The British high street electrical shop of the early 1930s was a crowded, competitive arena. Brands like Pi, Marconi, and Kossur were all vying for attention in the shop window. A consumer walking down the high street saw rows of polished wooden boxes. They were handsome, but they were uniform. EKCO's management realized that bakelite offered a unique marketing weapon: the ability to break free from the straight lines dictated by woodworking tools. Bakelite could curve. It could flow. It could be stamped with intricate grills that would be impossible to carve by hand. The turning point came when EKCO decided to stop treating bakelite as a cheap substitute for wood and start treating it as a premium material in its own right. They began to sponsor design competitions, seeking out radical new concepts for the domestic wireless set. They wanted a cabinet that looked like the future, an object that a modern British family would be proud to place on a mantelpiece or a prominent sideboard. They found their answer not from a radio engineer, but from a modernist architect. And in 1934, that collaboration would produce a radio receiver that completely redefined the geometry of British broadcasting. The era of the wooden box was over. The era of the circle was about to begin. In 1934, the British sitting room was a conservative space. It was a room defined by heavy mahogany, floral wallpapers, straight wooden edges, and deeply traditional furniture. Into this environment, EKCO dropped an object that looked as though it had fallen from a different century. It was the EKCO AD65, designed not by a traditional cabinet maker or a seasoned wireless engineer, but by the pioneering modernist architect Wells Coates. The AD65 completely discarded the concept of the radio as a square wooden box. Coates argued that a radio receiver, a device that selects a broadcast signal from the air and turns it into sound, had no mechanical need to be rectangular. The essential geometry of sound is radiating and circular. A loudspeaker cone is circular. Therefore, Coates reasoned, the cabinet should naturally flow around the speaker, stripping away all unnecessary corners. The result was a perfect, uninterrupted circle of molded bakelite, 15.5 inches in diameter, sitting on an integrated structural base. It was radically simple and completely unprecedented. The tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, was not a small, apologetic square window in the center. Instead, it was an elegant, illuminated semicircle sweeping across the top edge of the cabinet. The loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air, dominated the front face. It was protected not by cheap dust-gathering cloth, but by a bold, geometric bakelite grille that resembled the strong spokes of an industrial machine. Inside this striking shell, the AD65 was a highly competent valve radio. A radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era. When the listener turned the main control knob, they were adjusting a heavy metal tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many. It was designed to confidently pull in the BBC national and regional programs on medium wave, a broadcast band historically used for many domestic radio services, as well as on long wave, a lower-frequency broadcast band used for long-distance national radio reception. When it appeared in British high-street electrical shops in late 1934, it caused an immediate visceral sensation. A prospective buyer walking past an independent radio dealer in Essex, or looking into the heavily dressed window of a larger chain like Curry's in London, had never seen anything like it. It was offered in two main finishes: a mottled brown walnut effect bakelite to appease those who still wanted a wood-like tone in their sitting room, and a striking ultra-modern black bakelite with chromium-plated detailing that commanded an even higher premium. But this modernism was not cheap. The standard AD65 was introduced at a price of 10 guineas, £10 and 10 shillings. In 1934, when the average weekly wage for a working-class man in Britain might barely reach £3, this was a significant domestic investment. It was the equivalent of nearly a month's wages for an ordinary family, a purchase that required serious budgeting or a hire purchase agreement. Yet, it sold in its tens of thousands. The success of the AD65 was not just an aesthetic triumph. It established a massive structural advantage for the company. It created a formidable British radio moat. Any competent engineer in a garden shed could wire together a basic valve circuit, build a wooden box, and call himself a radio manufacturer. Hundreds of small British companies did exactly that throughout the 1920s and 30s. But nobody could simply copy an EKCO AD65. To produce a continuous, curved, flawless cabinet of that size required industrial hydraulic presses capable of exerting thousands of tons of pressure. It required vast, expensive steel molds that had to be precision-engineered to prevent the bakelite from warping, blistering, or cracking as it cooled. It required a massive, heavily capitalized factory infrastructure. By building out the Southend-on-Sea plastics works to handle these giant presses, EKCO essentially priced amateur competitors out of the premium design market. They transformed the wireless from a carpenter's product into a heavy industrial plastics product. The British radio establishment took notice immediately. The highly influential trade and hobbyist magazines of the era evaluated the set with a mixture of technical scrutiny and aesthetic awe. Wireless World, the authoritative and rigorous voice of British radio engineering, praised not only its striking appearance, but the practical acoustic benefits of its rigid, non-resonant bakelite shell. which prevented the cabinet rattle common in cheap wooden sets. Practical wireless, read by thousands of high-street service engineers and serious hobbyists, noted the highly efficient layout of the internal metal chassis, which had been specifically designed by EKCO engineers to fit the circular confines without overheating the delicate glass valves. In prestigious London department stores like Harrods and Selfridges, the AD65 was displayed not just as a piece of electrical equipment, but as a modern lifestyle accessory. In provincial high-street shops from Manchester to Glasgow, it became the flagship window model that drew curious customers through the door. For the BBC listener settling into an armchair for an evening broadcast, the AD65 offered something entirely new. The physical ritual of tuning felt like operating a piece of the future. The dial lamps glowed warmly in the dark room, illuminating station names from across Europe alongside Droitwich and London. Behind the striking exterior, the set had to perform. It had to possess the selectivity, how well a radio separates one station from nearby stations, to pick out British signals from a crowded, noisy European airspace. It required the sensitivity, how well a radio picks up weak signals, to ensure that a household hundreds of miles away could hear a national broadcast without a constant hiss of interference, unwanted noise or disturbance added to the signal. EKCO had gambled the future of their Southend factory on the belief that the British public was ready for radical design, provided the engineering inside was absolutely reliable. They understood that a modernist cabinet would catch the eye, but only clear voices, warm music, and flawless daily operation would keep the set on the sitting room sideboard for years to come. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. The success of the AD65 transformed Eric Kirkham Cole's company from a clever electronics firm into a dominant industrial empire. By 1939, the Southend-on-Sea factory was not merely a building, it was a sprawling, self-contained manufacturing city. It had become the lifeblood of the local Essex economy. At its peak, the EKCO works employed approximately 8,000 people. The site was a deafening, highly choreographed theater of British industrial power. In the plastics division, towering hydraulic presses, some capable of exerting thousands of tons of pressure, stamped out dark, glossy bakelite cabinets 24 hours a day. The smell of heated phenolic resin hung heavy in the air over the town. In the assembly halls, hundreds of women sat in long, disciplined rows at wooden workbenches, wielding hot soldering irons to wire the intricate valve circuits by hand. Every tuning dial, every aerial coil, every loudspeaker cone was tested, aligned, and fitted before the finished wireless set was boxed and loaded onto railway wagons bound for the high street. EKCO had mastered the British distribution network. In the late 1930s and into the post-war era, an EKCO radio was a high-street staple. From the large, brightly lit windows of Curry's branches in London to the cluttered, deeply knowledgeable independent radio dealers in market towns across the Midlands, the EKCO badge commanded premium shelf space. They were prominently featured in mail-order catalogues, allowing families in rural Yorkshire or remote Scottish villages to purchase a piece of Southend modernism on a weekly hire purchase agreement. But the true test of EKCO's engineering came not from the high street, but from the sky. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, the British listening habit changed overnight. The wireless set was no longer just a source of light entertainment. It became the primary tether to reality. The BBC Home Service, the national broadcasting channel that provided news, government announcements, and morale-boosting programs during the conflict, was the single most important voice in the country. In blacked-out sitting rooms and anxious wartime kitchens, families gathered around their EKCO sets to hear the measured, steadying tones of BBC newsreaders and the speeches of Winston Churchill. The reliability of the valve radio was now a matter of national security. A failed tuning capacitor or a burnt-out valve meant isolation from the war effort. Because the massive Southend-on-Sea factory was located on the Thames estuary directly under the flight path of German bombers heading for London, it was deemed too strategically vital and too vulnerable to remain fully operational on the coast. The British government ordered the immediate dispersal of EKCO's critical engineering divisions. Production was hastily moved to a secret shadow factory in Malmesbury, Wiltshire. In Malmesbury, EKCO's engineers ceased making domestic wireless cabinets and pivoted entirely to military survival. They applied their deep knowledge of radio frequencies and valve amplification to a new, highly classified technology, radar. EKCO built the airborne interception radar systems that guided RAF night fighters, and the ASV, air-to-surface vessel radar, that helped Coastal Command hunt German U-boats in the Atlantic. The company that had designed beautiful circular radios for the sitting room was now wiring the electronic eyes of the British military. When peace returned in 1945, EKCO moved back to Southend-on-Sea with a heavily expanded engineering capability and a workforce trained to the highest military standards. They had survived the Blitz, they had helped win the war, and they were about to enter their most lucrative, dominant decade. The post-war British consumer was desperate for modernity, and EKCO was perfectly positioned to deliver it. They resumed civilian production with intense energy, releasing new bakelite models that captured the optimistic, forward-looking mood of the late 1940s. They released the EKCO A22, another stunning circular design that refined the pre-war aesthetic for a new generation. They expanded heavily into car radios, becoming the factory-fitted standard for several British motor manufacturers. And, crucially, they began to manufacture television sets, using their massive bakelite presses to mold the complex casings needed to hold heavy, dangerous cathode ray tubes. By the early 1950s, the EKCO name was woven into the absolute fabric of domestic British life. Chelmsford built the transmitters. The BBC carried the signal. The High Street sold the set. But it was Southend-on-Sea that gave that signal its physical shape in the home. By the mid-1950s, Eric Kirkham Cole's company had achieved something rare in British manufacturing: absolute cultural saturation. The dark, heavy bakelite of the 1930s had evolved. The Southend-on-Sea Plastics division had grown so vast and technologically advanced that it was no longer just producing radio cabinets. EKCO Plastics was manufacturing everything from industrial components to domestic bathroom fittings, using massive new injection molding machines. Yet, despite this massive industrial diversification, the wireless set remained the beating, glowing heart of the empire. The daily rhythm of the post-war British household was governed by the BBC Light programme, a national radio service offering music, comedy, and light entertainment to a population recovering from years of austerity. The bridge between that broadcast and the listener was the radio set. From the towering masts of the Droitwich transmitting station in Worcestershire, the long-wave signal traveled invisibly across the country, pouring directly into the ferrite rod aerial, a small internal magnetic component designed to pick up signals without an external wire, of an EKCO portable sitting on a Formica kitchen table in Bradford or a mantelpiece in Kent. The company also expanded aggressively into the heart of the home with radiograms, substantial pieces of domestic furniture combining a radio receiver, an amplifier, a loudspeaker, and a record player under a single polished wooden lid. These heavy, expensive units dominated the post-war front room. They built reliable car radios for the dashboards of the booming British motor industry. They built portable battery radios for the garden and the holiday caravan. On the British High Street, the EKCO distribution network was an ironclad system of commercial trust. An independent electrical shop in a provincial town proudly hung the illuminated EKCO authorized dealer sign above its window. In the 1950s, this badge was a guarantee not just of a sale, but of a long-term relationship. If an EKCO table radio, a radio designed to sit permanently on furniture rather than be carried, developed a fault, it did not end up in the dustbin. It entered the local service network, the shops, engineers, and repair counters that kept radios working after the initial purchase. A trained service engineer, armed with a soldering iron, an intricate circuit diagram, and a cardboard box of replacement glass valves, could quickly bring the voices back to life on a dusty workbench at the back of the shop. The South End-on-Sea Works had become a city of absolute self-reliance. They did not merely assemble parts bought from overseas. They molded their own plastics, wound their own tuning coils, stamped their own metal chassis, and rigorously tested every completed unit before it was allowed to leave Essex. Millions of EKCO sets were in circulation. For an entire generation of British listeners, the name on the dial was practically synonymous with the act of switching on the wireless. At this peak, an EKCO radio was not merely a mass-produced consumer product. It was a domestic companion. It was an EKCO valve radio sitting proudly on a polished sideboard in a British sitting room, its glass tuning dial glowing warmly in the evening with the names of distant European cities, its flawless cabinet warm to the touch, faithfully filling the room with the trusted, crackling voice of the BBC. That was the promise. That was the empire. And within a single decade, it would be entirely dismantled. The decline of the EKCO empire was not caused by a sudden failure of engineering, nor by a lack of ambition in Southend-on-Sea. It was dismantled by a brutal sequence of structural forces that systematically destroyed the independent British radio industry. The tragedy of EKCO is the story of a fiercely original design house slowly suffocated by corporate consolidation, shifting listening habits, and the relentless pressure of a changing high street. To understand the collapse, one must look at the British radio market at the end of the 1950s. Three immense market forces were converging on the Essex factory simultaneously. The first was the sheer cost of British manufacturing. Force 1. EKCO's entire business model was built on heavy industrial infrastructure, massive bakelite presses, thousands of skilled workers, and meticulous domestic assembly. But as component costs and domestic labor became more expensive, producing a heavy premium valve radio in Britain began to yield diminishing financial returns. The market was saturating. By the late 1950s, almost every household that wanted a valve radio or a radiogram already owned one. The post-war boom was over. The second pressure was Force 4, the arrival of imported private label electronics and the era of good-enough listening. The British public was beginning to encounter small, brightly colored transistor radios from Japan and Hong Kong. The transistor, a small electronic component that controls or amplifies signals with less heat and power than a glass valve, fundamentally changed what a radio could be. A transistor radio did not need a heavy mains transformer. It did not need a massive bakelite cabinet to dissipate heat. It was lightweight, battery-powered, and cheap to assemble. EKCO understood the transistor, but their entire industrial identity was tied to the heavy, permanent mains receiver. They were masters of the sitting room, but the transistor radio was moving the listening habit into the bedroom, the garden, and the pockets of teenagers. The new generation of listeners did not care about the acoustic properties of a heavy bakelite cabinet. They cared about portability and price. The third and ultimately fatal pressure was Force 5, the massive technological and retail shift that forced independent British companies into desperate alliances. The British turning point arrived in 1960. facing a saturated domestic market, rising production costs, and the looming threat of cheap imports, EKCO's management made a decision that would forever alter the company's trajectory. They agreed to merge with their fierce domestic rival, Pi Radio of Cambridge. The two companies combined to form a new corporate entity, British Electronic Industries. On paper, the merger appeared logical. Pi was a giant of industrial radio and television. EKCO was a master of plastics and domestic design. Together, they were supposed to create an impenetrable British electronics conglomerate capable of fighting off foreign competition. In reality, the creation of British Electronic Industries was the beginning of the end for the EKCO badge. When two massive radio manufacturers merge, the first casualty is almost always design autonomy. The new corporate board looked at the duplicated efforts across the two companies and demanded immediate rationalization. There was no longer any commercial justification for Pi engineers in Cambridge and EKCO engineers in Southend-on-Sea to design entirely different internal circuits for competing radios. The retreat of the EKCO identity began on the assembly line. The company transitioned to using the printed circuit board, a flat board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, replacing the traditional labor-intensive method of wiring components together by hand. While this was a necessary modernization, it made the internal workings of a radio entirely generic. Soon, the dreaded practice of badge engineering infected the Southend works. A new radio model would be designed centrally by the conglomerate. It would be manufactured on a single production line. At the very end of the process, half the radios would be fitted with a Pi badge, and the other half would be fitted with an EKCO badge. They were sold in the same high-street shops, often at slightly different price points, but internally, they were identical machines. The EKCO badge, which in 1934 had represented the absolute pinnacle of modernist architecture and bespoke British engineering, was slowly being reduced to a mere marketing sticker. A prospective buyer in a Currys or a local independent dealer was no longer buying an EKCO. They were buying a generic British Electronic Industries chassis with an EKCO logo glued to the front. The Southend-on-Sea factory, once the fiercely proud center of Eric Kirkham Cole's empire, began to lose its unique purpose. The magnificent bakelite presses, which had defined the shape of British broadcasting for 2 decades, were increasingly repurposed for mundane household plastics, while the radio division was systematically hollowed out. The room did not care about the corporate brochure. The signal did not care about the newly rationalized supply chain. The listener, subconsciously but inevitably, began to notice that an EKCO radio no longer felt like an EKCO. The promise of the badge was breaking, but the final blow was yet to come. The merger with Pi had only delayed the inevitable. The independent British radio industry was not merely shrinking, it was about to be swallowed whole by a European giant. And the name that had defined the British sitting room would be quietly, ruthlessly erased from the dial. In 1967, the illusion of a combined British electronics superpower shattered completely. British Electronic Industries, the conglomerate formed by the merger of Pi and EKCO, was struggling under its own cumbersome weight. It was entirely absorbed by the Dutch multinational giant Philips. Philips did not buy EKCO to build better radios in Essex. The Dutch parent company already possessed massive, highly efficient manufacturing plants across Europe and Asia, perfectly optimized for the new era of cheap, lightweight electronics. What Philips bought was the British distribution network, the high-street dealer contracts, and the residual loyalty attached to the EKCO name. The actual engineering capability at Southend-on-Sea was deemed almost entirely redundant. The Southend Works, which had once employed 8,000 people and dominated the local skyline, suffered a slow, humiliating death by 1,000 corporate cuts. The magnificent plastics division, which had pioneered the heavy bakelite cabinets of the 1930s, was increasingly irrelevant. The global market had moved on to cheap injection-molded thermoplastics that could be produced anywhere in the world for fractions of a penny. The vast assembly lines, where hundreds of skilled women had once painstakingly soldered valve circuits by hand, were quietly dismantled. The British listening culture was also changing, moving further away from the products Southend was built to make. In 1967, the BBC reorganized its national broadcasting. The light program evolved into Radio 2, and the newly launched Radio 1 catered to a youth market that demanded pop music on medium wave. These new listeners did not sit respectfully around a heavy table radio in the sitting room. They listened in bedrooms, on buses, and in parks, using cheap, imported, battery-powered portable radios. This was the brutal reality of Force 4, the wave of Japanese and Hong Kong imports. Brands like Sony and Sanyo offered transistor radios that were smaller, cheaper, and perfectly adequate for listening to pop music. They did not require a heavy mains transformer. They did not need to last for 30 years. They were essentially disposable. Simultaneously, Force 3, the high street retail shift, destroyed the EKCO distribution moat. The traditional independent radio shop, where a knowledgeable dealer sold a premium British set and maintained it through a local repair counter, was dying. The market was being captured by discount electrical retailers and department stores that competed entirely on price. A consumer walking into a brightly lit discount store in 1975 did not care about the acoustic properties of a rigid cabinet or the legacy of British engineering. They cared about the price tag on the shelf. If the imported radio broke, it was not taken to a service engineer with a soldering iron. It was simply thrown in the dustbin and replaced. Under Philips's ownership, the EKCO name suffered the ultimate indignity of the corporate electronics world. Absolute brand dilution. The badge that had once been synonymous with Wells Coates's modernist masterpiece was licensed out and slapped onto entirely unrelated, low-budget products. A British consumer in the 1970s might find the EKCO name printed on a cheap imported clock radio, a small radio combined with an alarm clock for the bedside table, or a generic plastic cassette recorder. The name was even attached to the EKCO Hostess trolley, a heated cart for dining rooms that had absolutely nothing to do with radio engineering. The promise of the badge was not just broken, it was mocked. A name that once guaranteed absolute reception and bespoke British cabinet design now meant absolutely nothing. It was just another piece of intellectual property to be exploited until the public stopped recognizing it. The final British chapter for EKCO was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, bureaucratic erasure. Production at Southend-on-Sea was steadily outsourced or moved to other Philips facilities. The factory was eventually closed, the land sold, and the workforce scattered into other industries. The heavy hydraulic presses were dismantled. The intricate molds that had shaped the history of British broadcasting were discarded. The independent British radio industry did not die because it forgot how to engineer. It died because the market decided that convenience and price were infinitely more valuable than permanence and repairability. The high street dealer disappeared. The service counter closed. The overseas imports flooded in. The plastic became cheaper. The factory gates locked. The heavy presses were scrapped. The catalog dropped the name. The tuning dial went dark. The Southend Empire was gone. The name EKCO did not survive the transition into the 21st century. Unlike Bush or Roberts, which were eventually revived as heritage brands, selling DAB radios and Bluetooth speakers wrapped in retro styling, the EKCO badge was allowed to die completely. When Philips had finally exhausted the brand's residual goodwill on cheap imports and kitchen appliances, They simply stopped printing the name. There was no grand resurrection. There was no nostalgic reissue of the circular radio. The corporate entity that Eric Kirkham Cole built was entirely erased from the British commercial register. To find the physical footprint of that empire today, you must travel to Southend-on-Sea. If you walk down Priory Crescent, the deafening roar of the massive hydraulic plastics presses is entirely gone. The sprawling factory complex that once employed 8,000 people, that built the radar systems for the Second World War, and that pressed the dark bakelite cabinets of the British sitting room, was systematically demolished. In its place stands a modern, quiet residential development. It is appropriately named EKCO Park. People now sleep, eat, and watch television on the exact geographical coordinates where thousands of local women once wielded hot soldering irons, wiring the valve circuits of a national listening habit. The industrial infrastructure has been replaced by the domestic spaces it once sought to furnish. But while the factory and the corporate name were obliterated, the physical objects stubbornly refused to disappear. Today, the surviving EKCO valve radios are fiercely protected. They have bypassed the high street entirely and entered the realm of high-end antiques and dedicated enthusiast preservation. In the British Vintage Wireless Society and across online auction sites like eBay and Gumtree, an intact, uncracked EKCO AD65 or A22 is considered the holy grail of domestic radio collecting. The secondary market is highly specific and deeply unforgiving. Because bakelite, an early hard plastic used for many radio cabinets, strong, moldable, and visually distinctive, is inherently brittle. It cannot easily be repaired once cracked. A drop from a sitting room sideboard in 1954 might mean a fatal fracture. Therefore, collectors hunt for flawless cabinets. They spend hours carefully polishing the mottled brown or rare black surfaces to restore the original 1930s gloss. On dusty repair benches in garden sheds and garages across the country, dedicated engineers meticulously rebuild the internal power supplies and replace failing paper capacitors, components that store and release electrical energy in a circuit, to ensure these 80-year-old machines can safely plug into modern British mains sockets. Why does this community invest so much time and money into preserving a dead format? It is because an original EKCO valve radio offers a physical relationship with broadcasting that modern audio equipment has entirely abandoned. Today, a kitchen or sitting room is likely equipped with a smart speaker, a connected speaker that plays radio and music through voice commands and online services. The smart speaker has no tuning dial, no glass valves, and no physical presence. It is a convenience device, an invisible servant. It removes all friction from the act of listening. An EKCO radio, by contrast, demands absolute physical participation. The listener must wait for the glass valves to warm up. They must turn the heavy tuning control, physically moving the metal plates of the tuning capacitor, searching through the static to find the exact frequency of the broadcast. The warm, glowing light of the dial lamps illuminates a map of a bygone European airspace, a literal window into a different era of communication. The acoustic warmth of the large circular bakelite cabinet moving the air produces a rich, resonant tone that a tiny, hidden digital speaker simply cannot replicate. The EKCO asks the listener to meet the signal halfway. There is a profound, surprising footnote to the EKCO story, hidden in the long shadow of its corporate collapse. While the beautiful domestic radio division was hollowed out and destroyed by badge engineering, the heavily classified military radar division that EKCO built during the emergency dispersal to Malmesbury in the Second World War actually survived. Long after the EKCO name vanished from the high street electrical shop, The radar technology they pioneered continued to evolve, eventually being absorbed into major British aerospace and defense contractors. The engineers who started out trying to build a better wooden box to replace a messy acid battery ended up leaving their most lasting, functional legacy in the skies rather than in the sitting room. Yet, it is the sitting room object that history remembers. The story of EKCO reveals a great, uncomfortable truth about how Britain consumes technology. It exposes the vast gap between what a culture claims to value as art and what the high street market actually rewards. Today, the British design establishment reveres the EKCO AD65. It sits proudly behind glass in the Victoria and Albert Museum as a definitive masterpiece of 20th century industrial architecture. It is celebrated as a pinnacle of bespoke British engineering, bold geometry, and domestic permanence. But the market that originally consumed it did not care about permanence. When the technological and retail shift arrived, the British public happily abandoned the heavy, repairable, beautiful valve radio in favor of the cheap, imported, disposable plastic transistor, and later, the invisible digital stream. The market praised the heritage, but it bought the convenience. The empire was not defeated by a failure of imagination in Southend-on-Sea. It was defeated by the sheer, ruthless arithmetic of globalized retail and the shifting expectations of the everyday listener. But the objects that survived that collapse remain, standing as heavy, glowing monuments to a time when the radio was the most important piece of architecture in the room. Somewhere in a quiet Essex workshop, a circular brown bakelite cabinet sits on a scarred wooden repair bench. The soldering iron is hot, the glass valves are warming, and the sweeping semicircular tuning dial remains perfectly intact, waiting for a hand to turn the knob and pull one more voice from the air. See you in the next one.